Well, I have with me Dr. Paul Peters from the University of New Brunswick, and Paul is one of a network of researchers that does interesting research on population-related issues in sparsely populated areas. Welcome, Dr. Peters, and thank you for taking the time to be part of our course.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit about your areas of research and what interests you about sparsely populated areas?
Sure. I do a bit of a wide range of research in sparsely populated areas. Some of it's related to demographic change and the methods we use to analyze this change in small, sparsely populated areas, particularly in the smallest villages. So how can we get beyond the regular demographic tools that are generally only applicable at the regional level? So how can we begin to look at small communities instead, sort of begin to drill down in this? And once we drill down to a certain level and begin to look at really small places, we need to start integrating different methods from other areas. So in particular, our traditional forecasting models and things like that, or models of mortality and life expectancy generally don't hold when we only have 150, 250 people in a village. So I'm interested in the methods that we use to do that. And that then integrates both quantitative and qualitative. And I'm interested in that in terms of a spatial sense. So then also the spatial relationships that we would have, not just with the individuals, but with the communities and outside of that. Alongside that, and alongside once we're beginning to the analysis, is how do we do this and what data do we use to do it? So how can we get our hands on data that can sort of represent or provide a picture of the community from which we can make some sort of conclusions or begin to develop some potential scenarios.
Mm. And what sort of methods do you think or techniques for modelling might work under circumstances where some of the data that is more robust for larger places like big cities might not be so robust for the smaller settlements that we look at in our research? I'm aware, for example, that you do some agent-based modelling. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So agent-based modelling is an area of research that's been around really since the 1970s, 1960s, and grew out of a completely different area outside the social sciences. And it's been applied to looking at frontier settlements and communities really for the past 6 to 8 years. And it's a method where we can populate a model of change with a small number of individuals, usually using census data as the backbone. So looking at creating a population where there's artificial or based on the actual data in terms of the number of people with certain ages and different age groups with certain sex ratios and things like that. Then we can begin to move those people forward in time and make them do things. So if we have a static population that exists with a certain number of people at different ages, they all have an age, they have a sex, but then we can do things like creating families and creating households. And then we can allow people to move into the community or move out, and we can allow people to have children and allow people to divorce and things like that. And using other information that we can get at perhaps broader regional level rates or trends, we can develop probabilities that families would do this and individuals would arrive and individuals would move out. And the thing with agent-based modeling is it allows each individual to have behaviors unto themselves. So as we move forward in time, and every year that the model moves forward, they have a probability of acting, doing something, whether that's moving, whether that's migrating, whether that's having a kid, whether that's dying, or the family forming or family dissipating. And we can change that over time, and every time we run this model, let's say we run it over 30 years, we'll get a different result because they have a certain randomness built into it. So what's really good at doing is when we have these small communities, we can run repeated trials, and we can run it, let's say, over 100 or over 200 or 500 different scenarios relatively quickly, and we can look at the range of outcomes that can happen. And so then we can look at a potential median scenario, like what might happen on average, what would sort of be the most likely, or we can look at the extremes and say, well, let's look at this. All of a sudden our community is declining sharply. What happened there? Or we can look at it where it's increasing greatly. What happened there? So this is sort of the crux of agent-based modeling within small small communities.
Terrific, terrific. Now you mentioned, just before, you mentioned sources of data for demographic analysis, and I'm aware that you worked for Statistics Canada for some time. Like the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it's been through some tumultuous changes and times, but people like you and I guess, realise the importance of the census and the other collections that these agencies undertake. Could you shed a bit of light on how important the census is in the Canadian remote context, and sort of any other issues you see in the future with our statistical agencies?
I think the census is really key for understanding the communities and the broader trends. And I say that with some caveats in that for some small communities, the individuals within the communities and the community leaders would probably have a better handle on what's happening in their community than would the General Statistics Bureau. So out of a community of 250, the mayor who has lived there for 50 years probably knows more about what's going on with the community, who's having a kid, who's thinking about having a kid, who's moved and where they live, and things like that. So that's real detailed knowledge. But in terms of being able to compare that community with other ones around it, or begin to look at potential trajectories for how that community might respond to events, such as employment events, let's say effects of climate change, changing economies, things like that, they really begin to rely on external data. So we need to have some sort of a picture on the level of unemployment, where people are employed, and where it sits within the broader region. And we can really only get that from having really highly reliable and detailed sources that are collected at the national level. And the federal statistical agencies, the Australian Bureau of Statistics and Statistics Canada, US Census Bureau and things like that, are really sort of the places where this happens, where they have these checkpoints that provide a sufficient level of detail for small areas, and we have a base knowledge then on that. Even just a simple base knowledge of how many people live in the community at a certain point in time, and how many of those people have moved there within the last 5 years. You know, those are questions that are basic on the census. They're part of the full, what we would call the long form, the short form census, so it's the census that everyone answers, not the full set of questions. And that allows us then to compare where that community sits compared to the broader region. We can look at the broader regional trends, compare that to the community, compare other communities of similar size and things like that. So that's really one of the underpinning where I see the importance of the data.
Yeah, great. And a final question for you. What do you see as the under-researched areas in terms of sparsely populated areas? What critical questions do you think remain unanswered for the places that we talk about in our research?
I think some of the under-researched areas are, I'm going to point out two areas, and one is the integration of methods that we use to do this. So particularly the integration of qualitative and quantitative research. So there are a lot of qualitative studies, a lot of qualitative research that goes on in small remote communities. And we see that across the different domains, whether it's in tourism, whether it's in health, whether it's in community capacity, whether it's in psychological distress, or even economic. We do look at qualitative. And in terms of the quantitative analysis, generally it sits at a much higher level, and we look at groupings of like communities for doing the quantitative analysis. But I think things like agent-based modeling and other things looking at data linkage, so linking different data sources, really is an area where we can begin to link those qualitative methods and the quantitative, and vice versa. So we can begin to share information and share methodologies that can allow us to move beyond just the explanations of now we have more people who are over 65, now we can actually have some rationale. Another area I think that, although there's been perhaps a large number of publications, I think there's a tremendous amount of room for growth is in the area of migration. And migration is one of these things that is always changing, and there's always different types of migration. Over the past 5 years in particular, we've seen changing patterns in international migration, most recently being refugee crises from Syria and from Afghanistan and other areas, where we have millions upon millions of migrants moving around the globe. And in many countries, we have new migrants arriving in these countries, and many of them are arriving to small rural areas. So, we need to look at the effect of, what is the effect of 10 families moving to a community of 1,000 in a small rural community. And it will could potentially have a great effect. And over the past, century, there's been periods of where this happens, and people come from different areas. And then there are sort of, these cyclical trends of in-migration and out-migration. But I don't think that there's a level of research that does need to go on and begin to answer some of the, begin to look at the effects of some of these on communities, particularly with community resiliency and how communities can move towards, what's going to happen in the next 50 years, 100 years, things like that.
All right.
There's 2 areas for it.
Yeah. So thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dr. Peters, for your time and your contribution to our course. And
of course,
we wish you the best for your research.
Thank you.
Thank
Best of
you.
luck.